Nishidaisuken, and I will be talking to you about building games with visual tools, specifically Game Maker Studio. As you can see here, I have Game Maker Studio open, and it's actually Game Maker Studio 2, which is the latest version. So, before we begin any development, I'm going to first show you what the finished result of our game will look like at the end of Lesson 3. And it is running. So this is a game that we'll be making where you control a player and you have to avoid these monsters and you can shoot them and you get points. So your score builds up, and if you accidentally hit one of these monsters, the game restarts. So to build this game, we're going to learn how to do that with using drag and drop tools in Game Maker Studio. So what we start with is when we're creating a new project, we make sure to select drag and drop. We're going to save it wherever you desire, and I'm going to save it as a project called Example. Now, Game Maker Studio will show you an interface that's quite open, and that's because we haven't done anything to it yet. So the first thing I'm going to teach you is how to import sprites. And so the first thing we want to do is, on the right side, we have different types of entities that we can import into Game Maker. So sprites, we're going to create a sprite from an image. So to do that, we right-click on the sprites and create sprite from images. Then in our folders, we find whichever image that we want to import the sprite from. So I'm actually going to find it, and mine is a character, and I will provide you a link to find this specific character as well that I designed myself. So this is now a sprite, and you get to see it in the workspace area where pretty much all your editing will happen. So inside this workspace area, we have the sprite, and we've imported it as an image. Now what we want to do is see this sprite in a game. So what we do first is we create a room. A room is what you're actually going to have as a space for the game. By default, there's already a room created, so it's called Room 0, and we're going to double click that, and that'll open up Room 0 as a tab here. And if you ever want to go back to the other view, you can see it. Workspace 1 is the workspace that we had before. So going back to Room 0, this is the viewport of what you'll see when you click play on the game. So we want to get this sprite to show up on the screen when you play the game. So to do that, we have to actually make an object. An object is an object that's actually going to be existing in the room. A sprite is just an image. So the object, we're going to create an object. We're going to call it obj_player. And to make sure that we know the difference between the sprites and the objects, we're going to rename the sprite to spr_player. So now what we do is, with this object, you'll see that all the details of it are right here in the workspace. If you ever want to see the details of something specific, you can double click it on the right here. So I just double click the sprite and it brings me to the sprite's details in the workspace. And if I double click object, it'll bring me to the object details. So the first thing we want to do here is assign a sprite to this object. So the sprite we want to use is sprite player, so we can choose that, and now this object has a sprite associated with it. Objects are the only things you can actually place in your room. So now we're going to take this object that has a sprite associated with it and place it in the room. So I'm going to click this object and drag it over to the center of the room. And right now, it's gigantic. So I actually want it to be quite a small player. So what I'm going to do is grab the corner of this box here and shrink it down. And I can hold shift while doing that to make sure the scale is uniform. If I don't hold shift, it'll go like all wonky, but if I hold shift, it stays to the same aspect ratio. So I'm going to make it about this size, maybe a little smaller, and I'm going to put it in the center of the room. And now we're going to see what the game looks like. So to play the game, you click Run here. You can also press F5 on your keyboard. I'm going to press Run, and it's going to do a lot of computation to compile, and then finally it'll open up this game. And what we'll have is the player in the center of the screen, the sprite. However, we can't do anything with it because we haven't built any of the logic that we need to make the player move, to make him shoot, to make enemies appear. So what we're going to do is now we're going to build the logic for moving the player around. So how do we build logic? On the object player, the object of the player, we have events. And events are basically things that happen when other things happen. So for example, I want the player to move right when I press the right arrow key. So the first thing you do is you choose what is the event that causes something else to happen. So what we're going to do is key down right. And so if I'm pressing down the right arrow key, something is going to happen. And so what I need to do is actually make the player move to the right when I press the right arrow key. So what we're going to use for that is I'm going to use this search box here and search for jump. And we're going to use jump to point. So what we want to do is when we're pressing right, we want to move the player to the right. So we take the x value, which is the horizontal value, and we're going to add a value to it. So I'm going to add 4 to the x value, and I'm going to make sure relative is checked. And what this does is it'll add 4. If we uncheck it, it's going to set the position of the object to 4, which is just going to move it to a specific location on the screen. So instead, we're going to add x plus 4. And in the y, we want to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere in the y when we press right. It doesn't go up or down at all. So it's going to be 0. And now, let's run the game and see what happens when I press down the right arrow key. It's loading up. And now when I press the right arrow key, the player moves to the right. That's pretty cool. And now we just have to do that for all the other directions. So let's do that really quickly, where we do key down, left, key down, up, key down, down. And what we can do is actually we can copy this, jump to, and we can paste that in here. And if we're pressing the left arrow key, we're going to want to go -4 in the x and 0 in the y. If we're pressing the up arrow key, we're going to want to go 0 in the x, and we're actually going to want to go -4 in the y. And the reason is actually when you go up in the y value, the player actually goes down. So when you're going down in the y value, the player will go up. And that's because the 0, 0 origin point is actually at the top left of the screen in computer graphics. And now finally when we're doing the down, we're going to go 0 in the x, and we're going to go 4 in the y. And so, as I said, it's going to add 4 to the y value, which actually moves it down. Now, let's press play and see what happens. And now, I actually have all 4 controls for up, down, left, and right. So, the next thing I'm actually going to do is make sure that the player will face the mouse position. So what we're going to do is actually create an event that happens when on the step. And what that means is it happens every single frame. It happens every time the screen is redrawn. So step on step, what we're going to do is we're going to set the direction of the object to the mouse position. So what you can look up is direction, and we have this thing called set point direction. So what we're going to have to do now is set the direction to the mouse position. And how we do that is we can actually type in variables into these positions, into these values. So instead of setting the point direction to 0 or 5 or whatever, we're actually going to set it to mouse underscore x. And that's actually the x position of the mouse. And we're going to set the y to the y position of the mouse. Now, this actually isn't quite enough to make it visually set the point direction. This sets the object's direction, but doesn't actually set the sprite to face that direction as well. So what we need to actually do is set the instance rotation to the direction that we just set with the mouses. So the way we do that is we set the angle to the direction, which is the direction of the object. And now the sprite will actually face that direction. So now what we can do is run the game and see the character, the player, following the mouse position. Oh, so this is an interesting little bug, and we see that the player is following the mouse, but he's also kind of turning around and looping around. So the way we fix that issue is in the sprite, which we can actually double click over here, what we need to do is set the origin point to the center. Right now, the origin is at 0, 0, which is the top left of the sprite, and what's happening is it's actually rotating around that point. And we need it to rotate around the center. So we can press this drop down and click middle center. And now you can see this tiny little plus, it might be difficult to see, is actually in the center. And so now if we press play again, it's loading up. And just like that, we have the player following the mouse position, and we can move him around in all directions with the arrow keys. Pretty cool. So the last thing we're going to do in this video is have the player be able to shoot some sort of bullet. And so what we're going to do for that is actually we're going to have to create our own sprite. So I'm going to show you a new way to create a sprite, which is actually to use the tools inside Game Maker to create a sprite by drawing it. So I'm going to create a sprite, and I'm going to call it SPR_bullet. And here is the sprite. We're going to edit the image, and I'm going to paint something that resembles sort of a bullet. And so here we go. This is a bullet. I'm not the best painter, but you can take the time that you want to make this look however you want. I have a little trail going on here, and I'm just going to use the fill tool to fill this green space with the green color. And then I'm going to make a little white outline around this so that it's just a little bit easier to see. So this is going to be our bullet, and I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back to our workspace, and you see that the sprite here is a bullet. And now what we need to do is create an object for the bullet. So I'm going to create a new object, and I'm going to call it obj_bullet. And this bullet is going to have the sprite, bullet sprite. And now what we need to do is we're going to create this bullet every time you click the mouse button. So what we want to do is we want to go to the object player, and we want to have an event for when you click the mouse. So what we can do is add an event, and we're going to go to mouse, and we're actually going to go to global down here. And I'm going to explain the difference between global and any of these. The difference is that all of these events here will actually happen when you click on the sprite itself, on the player sprite. But we don't want to just be able to click on the sprite, we want to be able to click anywhere on the canvas. So that's why we go to global, and we do left down. So global left down, and what we're going to do on global left down is actually we're going to create a bullet. So the way we do that is we can search instance, and there is something called create. So maybe it is, yeah, create instance. So there's actually something called create instance, and what we're going to do is create an instance of the object bullet, and we're going to create it relatively to this player at 0, 0. It's going to go into the layer instances, which is fine, and we're not going to set a target for now. So right now, when we press when we're holding down the global left mouse button, it's going to create an instance of the bullet object on top of the player. It's going to be 0, 0 relative to the player, which means that it's on top of the player. So we're actually going to play now and see what happens. So we move around, and I'm going to click, and it creates a bullet. And I'm going to click again, and it creates a bullet. What happens if I hold? Oh, it's creating a bunch of bullets. So this is what we're going to fix now. First, before we fix the issue of creating so many bullets, we're going to have these bullets actually move as soon as you create them. So what we're going to do is go to the sprite. We're going to make sure that actually the origin again is at the center of the bullet. So I just clicked in here to set the origin, and left clicked in here, and now the origin is somewhat in the center of the bullet. And then we're going to go back to the object bullet, and what we're going to do is create an event on create. And what that means is this is going to happen as soon as this object is created or instantiated or shows up in the game. And so what we're going to do on create is actually set the speed. So I'm going to search speed, and we're going to say set speed. In the direction that it's facing, we're going to set the speed of 5. So now as soon as this object is created, it's going to go in its direction at a speed of 5. So let's see what happens there. So now when I click, we have a bullet that goes in that direction at a speed of 5. The one thing you'll notice is that all the bullets are going to the right, and none of them are rotating to the point where I'm clicking. So what we actually need to do is fix that by, when we create this object, we need to set its rotation to the mouse position. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing that we did with the player essentially, and set the direction, set point direction to mouse X, and mouse Y, and then we're also going to set the rotation of the instance to the direction. So this is the exact same thing that we did in the player when on step, where we're doing it every single frame where we're making the player face the mouse direction. But now we're going to do it on the bullet as soon as the object is created, and only when it's created, not every single frame. So now, when we play, what happens is the bullet gets, when you click the mouse, the bullet gets created, it faces the direction of the mouse, and then it'll continue at that speed. So now we have bullets that actually go in the direction that you're facing, and we actually have the ability to create a lot of them if we hold it. We'll actually deal with the timing of how to delay how many are being created in the third lesson, but for now, this is all that we'll cover in the first lesson. Thank you.